All right, everybody, welcome back. We've got a really interesting deep dive for you today.
Yeah, this one is pretty wild.
We're looking at a few different sources today. We've got this piece from The Independent, some discussion happening on Reddit, and a report from the Wall Street Journal. And they're all looking at the same topic, which is this potential policy change.
Yeah, a big one.
That could really shake up scientific research here in the U.S. So this is coming from President-elect Trump's team, and it seems like they're thinking about revolutionizing the way research is funded.
Yeah, and the potential impact here is huge. We're not just talking about, like moving some money around or
Right.
tweaking a few things. This could actually redirect the entire flow of research.
Oh, absolutely.
And that could have ripple effects on everything.
Yeah, from, finding new cures to diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's to understanding the really complex mechanisms behind how diseases work. And at the heart of all this is this guy, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. He's Trump's pick to head the NIH. And
Yeah, the National Institutes of Health.
yeah, his proposal is to link federal research grants to something he calls academic freedom at universities.
And, on the surface, that sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Right.
Academic freedom, who wouldn't be for that? But when you dig a little deeper, it gets a lot more interesting.
Now, what does academic freedom even mean?
Right, exactly. And these sources are all kind of hinting that what Bhattacharya is really talking about is increasing viewpoint diversity in research.
So, he doesn't think there's enough diversity of thought in research right now.
Seems that way, and he seems particularly focused on institutions that he considers woke.
Right, so he's basically saying that cancel culture is silencing certain voices in academia, and he wants to use funding to change that.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
And the way he's proposing to measure this is really interesting.
Mm.
He wants to use these rankings from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE,
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
to basically grade universities on their commitment to free speech.
So it's like a free speech report card for universities.
Exactly. And if a university has a low FIRE score, even if they're doing cutting edge research, they could potentially lose out on these NIH grants.
And we're not talking about small amounts of money here.
No,
Yeah.
not at all. The NIH distributes something like $25 billion every single year.
Yeah.
A big chunk of that goes to funding research on things like immunotherapy for cancer and
Right. Imagine if suddenly all that research was put on hold because a university didn't meet some kind of academic freedom standard.
Exactly. That's the kind of impact we could be talking about here.
So it seems like there are some concerns that this focus on academic freedom, at least as Bhattacharya defines it, could actually hinder scientific progress.
Absolutely. And this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah. Bhattacharya seems to have a whole bunch of other plans as well.
Oh, wow. Like what?
Well, for example, he's talking about tackling scientific fraud by funding studies that just recreate existing research.
Interesting.
And he's also talking about starting a whole new scientific journal that would focus on more transparent peer review.
Oh, wow.
And then there's this idea of putting limits on how much grant money can be used for publication fees.
He's really trying to shake things up.
Yeah, it's like a complete overhaul of the system.
But this whole woke label, it's so vague.
Yeah, it is.
It's hard to even know what it means in the context of scientific research.
It's what even is woke research?
Right.
And how do you even measure that?
It makes you wonder if this is really about promoting viewpoint diversity or if it's more about aligning research priorities with certain political views.
Yeah, and that brings up a really important point, the potential for bias in funding decisions.
Oh, totally. If funding decisions are being based on some subjective idea of what's considered woke, then it's really concerning.
Exactly. And the pushback against this proposal has already been pretty fierce. Organizations like the Association of American Universities are really concerned.
What are they saying?
They're saying that injecting political considerations into medical research funding could have some really disastrous consequences.
Oh, I bet.
They're worried about potentially slowing down progress in areas like cystic fibrosis, cancer, and Alzheimer's.
Right. So on one side, you've got Bhattacharya arguing that certain institutions are stifling conservative viewpoints.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you've got these concerns that his approach could politicize science and undermine important research.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation for sure. And it's not just advocacy groups that are worried. Even some people from within the scientific community are raising concerns.
Like who?
Well, for instance, Ned Sharpless, the former director of the National Cancer Institute, he's pointed out that it might be really hard to actually implement these changes.
Yeah, how would that even work?
Right. He's suggesting that grant reviewers, who are the ones actually evaluating research proposals, they might resist following these new guidelines.
That's a good point,
It
because they're the ones who ultimately decide which research gets funded.
Exactly. So you've got this tension between a vision for a more ideologically diverse research landscape and the very real potential for disruption and bias in the system.
And it's the researchers and students who are caught in the middle.
Right. They're the ones who are trying to figure out what all this means for their work and their future.
And that's where Reddit comes in, right?
Exactly. It's like this digital town square where everybody's talking about this and sharing their thoughts and worries.
What are people saying on Reddit?
Oh, there are all sorts of reactions. Some people are drawing comparisons to historical examples of scientific suppression, like what happened in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, pretty heavy stuff. Others are worried about a brain drain, where talented researchers might just leave the U.S. and go to places that are more supportive of their work.
Yeah, that would be a huge loss for the U.S.
Absolutely. And some people are also concerned that politicizing science could damage the U.S.'s position as a leader in research and technology.
So potentially other countries that are more committed to supporting science could take the lead.
Exactly. And there are a lot of questions about Bhattacharya's motivations and whether his approach will actually lead to more viewpoint diversity or just create more bias.
So we've got a lot to unpack here. We've got a really controversial policy proposal, a clash of ideologies, and a lot of uncertainty about the future of research in the U.S.
It's a really fascinating and complex situation.
It's like we're on the edge of a scientific cliffhanger, and we're all waiting to see what happens next.
Exactly. And in the next part of this deep dive, we're going to explore some of the potential unintended consequences of this proposal and what it could mean for the future of scientific discoveries.
We'll be right back after a quick.
Oh, actually, we're going to keep going. No breaks in this deep dive.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, in that case, let's jump right back in. So you were saying there are some potential unintended consequences of this academic freedom policy.
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting here is that even if this policy is intended to promote a diversity of thought, it could actually end up doing the opposite.
Really?
How?
How so?
Well, imagine you're a researcher, especially like an early career researcher, who's really dependent on getting grants to fund their work.
Right. They
Yeah.
need that funding to survive.
Exactly. And then this policy comes along and suddenly they're worried that if their research is seen as controversial or goes against the prevailing ideology, they might not get funding.
So they start self-censoring, afraid to even explore certain research questions.
Exactly. It could create this chilling effect on scientific inquiry.
Yeah, instead of pushing boundaries and asking tough questions, researchers might just stick to safe topics to avoid jeopardizing their funding.
Right. And that brings us to another potential unintended consequence, which is the impact on scientific progress itself.
Because science thrives on the free exchange of ideas.
Exactly, even controversial ones. If researchers are pressured to conform to a certain ideology, we risk stifling innovation and missing out on potentially groundbreaking discoveries.
It's like putting science in a box and only allowing certain ideas to breathe.
Exactly. And when you think about how this might play out in different fields of study, it gets even more complicated.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Would a physics department be judged by the same academic freedom standards as a sociology department?
Right. Those are very different disciplines with different ways of approaching research and what might be considered controversial.
It seems almost impossible to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach to academic freedom that would work fairly across such a wide range of fields.
Yeah, and it also raises the question of who gets to decide what is woke or anti-woke in the first place.
Right. That's where this whole thing gets really subjective and potentially dangerous. It seems like this policy could be used to silence certain voices and elevate others, regardless of the quality of their research.
Exactly. And that could lead to accusations of political motivation, which would really damage public trust in science.
Yeah, once people start to question whether funding is being driven by politics rather than scientific merit, it really erodes the whole foundation of scientific discovery.
Absolutely, like building a house on sand. Eventually, the whole thing could collapse.
And this brings us back to those comparisons people were making on Reddit, to historical examples of scientific suppression.
Yeah, it's a scary thought to think that we could be heading down that path, especially in a country that's always been a leader in scientific freedom.
It's a reminder of how important it is to protect the integrity of science and to make sure that research is driven by evidence and not ideology.
Absolutely. And to think about all the potential breakthroughs we might have missed out on if researchers had been afraid to pursue certain lines of inquiry because they were worried about being labeled as too controversial.
That fear is very real, especially for young researchers who are just starting out and really need that funding to get their careers off the ground.
Right. If they feel like expressing certain viewpoints could jeopardize their chances of getting funding, they might just give up on whole areas of research that could be really important.
It creates this climate of fear and conformity, which is the opposite of what academic freedom should be about.
Exactly. And it's not just the individual researchers who might be affected. Universities as a whole could feel pressure to conform to certain ideological positions in order to secure funding.
So they might have to choose between upholding a certain ideology and pursuing research that could actually benefit humanity.
It's a really troubling thought, and it could lead to a homogenization of research where certain perspectives are prioritized over others, regardless of their scientific value.
It's like putting all your eggs in one basket and hoping for the best.
And we all know how that usually ends up. Now, to be fair, there are some arguments in favor of linking research funding to this idea of academic freedom.
Okay, let's hear them.
Well, some people argue that it's about ensuring a marketplace of ideas where all viewpoints, even those that are unpopular or controversial, have a chance to be heard and debated.
So the idea is to create a more balanced playing field where conservative viewpoints are given equal weight alongside more progressive ones.
Right. They argue that this is necessary to correct what they see as an imbalance in academia, where conservative voices are often marginalized or silenced.
But isn't the peer review process supposed to guard against bias? The idea is that only high-quality research gets published and funded, regardless of the researcher's political views.
In theory, yes. But the peer review process isn't perfect. It's still susceptible to biases, and some people argue that the current system is biased against conservative viewpoints.
So their argument is that this policy is necessary to make sure that all viewpoints are represented in scientific research.
That's the essence of their argument. Now, whether or not you agree with it is a matter of perspective.
Right, but it's important to understand both sides of the argument.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating. We're wrestling with really fundamental questions about the role of science in society, the limits of academic freedom, and what even constitutes truth.
Yeah, these are really big questions and there are no easy answers.
And it's a conversation that we need to have. We can't shy away from these difficult questions,
Yeah.
even if they make us uncomfortable.
Because the stakes are incredibly high.
They are. The future of scientific discovery and the impact it has on our lives depends on how we navigate these issues.
And this whole debate is happening against a backdrop of increasing political polarization, where it seems like people can't even agree on basic facts anymore.
Yeah, and trust in institutions, including those responsible for scientific research, is eroding.
It's like we're speaking different languages, even when we're using the same words.
Exactly. And that makes it almost impossible to have a productive conversation. When everything becomes politicized and every fact is viewed through an ideological lens, it's really hard to find common ground.
And that's a problem, because we need to be able to have these tough conversations.
We do. We need to be able to engage with viewpoints that we disagree with, challenge our own assumptions, and try to find ways to bridge the divides that separate us.
Because if we can't even agree on what's true, how can we possibly hope to address the big challenges facing our world, like climate change or pandemics or social inequality?
Exactly. And that's the real danger here. If we allow our political differences to dictate the direction of scientific inquiry, we risk undermining the very foundation of knowledge and progress.
Science should be a tool for understanding the world, not a weapon in political battles.
Well said. And that brings us to the heart of this deep dive. It's not just about research funding. It's about the very soul of science and its role in a democracy.
It's about protecting the integrity of the scientific process and making sure it remains a source of truth and a force for good, even in the midst of all this political turmoil.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for all of us to be informed and engaged citizens.
Right, because ultimately the future of science is in our hands.
It is. And in the next part of this deep dive, we're going to talk about how you, the listener, can navigate this complex landscape and make sense of all the information out there.
We'll be right back after a quick.
Oh, actually, no need for a break. Let's just keep this conversation going.
Oh, right. No breaks. Okay, so as I was saying, it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about you, the listener, and your role in all of this. We've thrown a lot at you already proposed policies, conflicting viewpoints, potential consequences. It can be pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
So how do you, as an informed and engaged listener, make sense of it all? How do you sift through all this information and figure out what to believe?
It's like trying to solve a giant jigsaw puzzle, but you don't even have the picture on the box.
Exactly. So let's talk about some strategies for putting this puzzle together. And I think the most important one is critical thinking.
Yeah, critical thinking is key.
And I'm not just talking about the kind of critical thinking you learn in school. I'm talking about cultivating a healthy skepticism about everything you hear and read, even questioning your own assumptions.
Right. It's about approaching information like a detective, looking for clues and patterns.
Exactly. Asking yourself questions like, who's saying this? Why are they saying it? What's their agenda?
And maybe even more importantly, what evidence are they using to support their claims?
Right. Is the evidence credible? Is it biased? Is there another side to the story that they're not telling?
It's about being an active participant in the process of understanding, not just passively absorbing whatever you come across.
Right. Like you're not just reading the news, you're interrogating it, testing its validity, looking for those little cracks in the story.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important point, being aware of your own biases.
Oh, that's a tough one. Because we all have biases, right? Even if we don't realize it.
We do. Our backgrounds, our experiences, our beliefs, all of these things shape how we see the world and how we interpret information.
So how do we guard against that? How do we see our own blind spots?
It's not easy, but one thing you can do is actively seek out diverse perspectives.
So don't just stick to sources that you already agree with.
Right. Get out of your echo chamber and expose yourself to viewpoints that make you uncomfortable, that challenge your assumptions.
Because it's so easy to get stuck in that bubble where everyone agrees with you and you never have to question your own beliefs.
Exactly. And that can lead to something called confirmation bias, where you're only looking for information that confirms what you already believe, even if it's not true.
So we need to be open to being wrong.
Absolutely. Being wrong is part of the learning process. We need to be willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence.
And that brings us to another really important skill, understanding the difference between fact and opinion.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. And it's getting harder and harder to tell the difference these days, especially with social media.
It's true. It's like everyone's an expert now, and everyone has a platform to share their opinions, but that doesn't mean those opinions are based on facts.
Right. Just because someone says something with a lot of confidence doesn't make it true. So how do we tell the difference? What are some of the warning signs?
Yeah, like what should make us suspicious?
Well, one red flag is the lack of evidence. If someone is making a claim, but they don't provide any evidence to support it, that's a pretty good indication that you should be skeptical.
Okay, so look for evidence.
Right. Another thing to watch out for is emotionally charged language or the use of logical fallacies.
Oh, those sound complicated.
They can be. But basically, a logical fallacy is a flaw in reasoning that makes an argument invalid.
So it's like a trick that makes an argument seem convincing even though it's not logically sound.
Exactly. One common fallacy is the ad hominem attack, where someone attacks the person making the argument instead of addressing the argument itself.
Oh yeah, I've seen that a lot online.
It's a way of shutting down debate without actually engaging with the other person's ideas.
So what are some other logical fallacies to watch out for?
Another common one is the appeal to authority, where someone cites an expert or authority figure to support their claim.
Oh, so like 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothpaste?
Exactly. But the problem is that even experts can be wrong, and they might have biases of their own, or they might be speaking outside of their area of expertise.
So we need to be careful about who we're trusting as experts.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just blindly accept what someone says just because they have a fancy title or a lot of followers. You need to evaluate the source of the information.
Okay, so we've talked about critical thinking, being aware of our own biases, and discerning fact from opinion. But where do we even find reliable information in the first place? I mean, there's just so much information out there, it's overwhelming.
It is, but a good place to start is with reputable sources. Look for sources that have a track record of accuracy, fairness, and objectivity.
So like established news organizations, academic journals, government agencies, things like that.
Exactly. Now, that's not to say that alternative sources of information can't be valuable, but you need to approach them with a healthy dose of skepticism and cross-reference the information with more established sources.
So it's about getting multiple perspectives and seeing where they overlap and where they diverge.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to dig deeper. If something piques your interest, follow the trail of evidence. Read the original research, check the footnotes, explore different viewpoints.
So basically, become an information detective.
Exactly. Uncover the hidden layers and get to the heart of the matter.
This all sounds like a lot of work, though. It's like we need a PhD in information literacy just to understand the news these days.
It can feel overwhelming, I know. But remember, it's a process. You don't have to become an expert overnight. Start small. Choose one topic that you're really interested in and apply these critical thinking skills.
So instead of just scrolling through headlines, actually take the time to read an article, analyze the arguments, consider different perspectives.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to have conversations with people who hold different views. Engage in respectful debate, challenge each other's assumptions, and see if you can find some common ground.
It's about turning disagreements into opportunities for learning.
Precisely. And that brings us back to this whole debate about academic freedom and research funding. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right. But by using these critical thinking skills, you can start to form your own informed opinion about this proposed policy and what it means for the future of science.
Exactly. Don't just accept what you hear from politicians or pundits. Do your own research, think critically, and come to your own conclusions.
You know, it's interesting. I'm starting to see a connection between these critical thinking skills and the idea of academic freedom that we were talking about earlier.
Oh, I like where you're going with this. Tell me more.
Certain viewpoints or ideologies, it's about creating an environment where all ideas can be freely explored, debated, and challenged, no matter how controversial they might be.
That's a great point. It's about fostering a culture of critical thinking where evidence and reason are valued above all else.
And where the pursuit of truth is the ultimate goal.
Exactly. And that pursuit of truth requires each of us to be active participants, not just passive consumers of information.
We need to be skeptical, curious, and engaged. We need to be willing to ask tough questions and challenge the status quo.
We do, and that's what this deep dive has really been all about. It's about empowering you, the listener, to become a more informed and engaged citizen.
Because ultimately, the future of science and the future of our world depends on our ability to think critically and make informed decisions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And this conversation has highlighted something really important. It's highlighted the importance of scientific literacy.
Yeah, for everyone, right?
Absolutely. And I don't mean like everyone needs to be a scientist or have a PhD. It's more about understanding the scientific process.
Right, like how science actually works.
Exactly. Appreciating the role of evidence, recognizing that science is always evolving. It's a journey, not a destination.
Yeah, imagine if everyone had a basic understanding of that, like
Yeah.
how to evaluate information based on evidence instead of just gut feelings or what their favorite politician says.
Oh, that would be amazing. We'd all be so much better equipped to make informed decisions, about everything from healthcare to climate change to all the new technology that's coming out.
It's like giving everyone a superpower.
Totally. The power to think critically and make informed decisions.
And it all starts with education,
Yeah.
right?
Definitely. We need to do a much better job of teaching scientific literacy in schools. And I don't just mean like memorizing facts. It's more about teaching kids how to think like scientists.
To be curious, to ask questions, to test their ideas.
Exactly. To not be afraid to be wrong, to see being wrong as part of the learning process.
Yeah, and it's not just about formal education either, right?
No, absolutely not. We need to create a culture where science is celebrated and accessible to everyone.
Like we need more science museums, more documentaries, more books and articles that make science fun and engaging.
Yes, and we need to make sure everyone has the opportunity to participate in the scientific conversation, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status.
Science shouldn't be this exclusive club, right?
Exactly. It should be a shared endeavor, something that benefits all of humanity.
And that brings me to my final thought, which is really the most important takeaway from this whole deep dive.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's about you, the listener, and the choices you make.
I like it. Bringing it back to the individual.
Because while all this talk about policy changes and funding is really important, it's also crucial to remember that each of us has a responsibility to engage with science in a meaningful way.
To think critically about the information we're consuming.
To ask questions, to be skeptical, to be curious.
And to remember that knowledge is a journey, not a destination.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to leave you with this thought. Embrace your curiosity, never stop asking questions, and keep exploring the amazing world around you. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.